Welcome, folks, to Last Week I Learned. This is our deep dive edition, and this week's deep dive is the Indian independence movement. Now, I am always looking for inspiration for deep dives, and this one is particularly convoluted how I got to here. So I was watching a YouTube, which I rarely do, and I got hooked on an interview with one of my favorite Bollywood actresses, Alia Bhatt, and it was an interview with her co-stars from a recent American movie. I can't remember the name, but Wonder Woman was in it. And I'm also terrible with the names of actors and actresses, so my apologies. But they were doing this interview, and I had never seen the movie. So I went and looked up the movie and watched that on Netflix. And then I was starting to wonder, what other movies with Alia Bhatt did I miss? And so I'm trying to, one was Darlings, which is incredible, very fascinating movie. It is definitely a trigger warning. It's violent and kind of disturbing, but very, one of the most unique storylines I've ever seen. But another one was RRR, which I had heard about but hadn't seen. And at this point by now, I've seen a lot of Bollywood movies, and that was one thing I learned in this deep dive is it's actually not a Bollywood movie. I'm still kind of learning the delineations of what is and isn't Bollywood. This one's actually a Tollywood movie. It's a different region in India with a different language. And RRR was actually originally in a different language. I watched the dubbed Hindi version because that's what I'm used to from watching Bollywood. But I was watching this movie, and what really got me is I felt like I didn't understand the historical context of what was going on. And one of the things that really surprised me is, my experience with Indian history is really brief, and it really is just Gandhi, right? So this movie was about kind of a more direct and violent rebellion against British rule. Obviously, the story is fictionalized, and I have some links in here that talk about some of the problems with that and the limitations of this movie. But it did get me thinking about what I missed in the Indian independence movement. And kind of at the conclusion of this deep dive it's very inconclusive for me, right? Really what I learned is I don't know a lot about this, and I am not very well qualified to talk about it. So I'm going to try to keep this very brief and high level, but I am going to try to link to some resources. But this is one of those cases where I'd be very wary of the resources I found, right? I don't know much about this. I don't know much about the nuances. At this point in time, with my level of understanding, I'm easily duped. So there's probably going to be mistakes in here. But really what this inspired was I need to learn a lot more about this. Now, what I did find interesting in this whole deep dive is if we go back to the start, right? The parallels between the British and really all European powers interactions with what we now call India, but we used to be, a complicated tapestry of empires. And honestly, to some degree, India is a very complicated country with, I think second to, or in the top 5 with Papua New Guinea for the most linguistic diversity. And especially when it comes to scripts, there's a great book I read that I think I gave away, which I'm always doing, very dumb, called, oh man, I forget. It breaks down the top 10 languages of the world, and it's really great. It's Babylon something. I'll see if I can find it. But it talked about, I think 2 or 3 of the top 10 languages were in India, but totally distinct, with totally distinct histories and in some cases distinct scripts. So very complicated place. Okay, back to my non-tangent talking about. I was talking about the origin of this. Now, what I found interesting was, one, the approach initially was merchants, right? And so I think what's interesting is one of the things that's told in the story of colonization, right, of European history is this idea that the Europeans had superior skills and were really these like well-heeled travelers, right? And what I find kind of funny and ironic is part of the reason that these explorations happened these were moonshots in hopes of figuring out new ways to find wealth. Like Spain, pre-discovery, quote unquote, of the Americas was not a wealthy country, right? And their wealth didn't even last for that long. They, in general, squandered it pretty quickly in terms of the long arc of history. And so that's what we see here is the British arrive in India as traders, right? And at this point, India has a huge textile industry. The spice trade, of course, is a thing that's happening. And what we've really seen in the region, I still have so much work to do here, but the broad strokes that I can understand were you're coming off of the Mongols coming down from the north and establishing the Mughal Empire, not Mongol, but Mughal, I think. I'm butchering that. But so you have this empire in the north, and that, when the British first come, is like slowly starting to disintegrate. So really what you have is this unfortunate timing where you have some regional instability caused by the slow, like, kind of degradation of a really old empire, right? Genghis Khan, I think, was 11 or 1200s. And they are, I think, moving into India probably within a couple hundred years of that. So this is a multi-hundred-year empire that's slowly coming apart in the north. And so at first the British are traders, and they're trying to exploit these regional differences because they don't have that many people there, right? And they're using trade as kind of a push there. And they're there as guests, right? They do not have much power in this case because all they're doing is moving goods. They're not producing them. And so what you see over time is eventually, partly because of their American colony, they start to grow in wealth and power, right? And so that's one of the things to keep in mind here is these things are happening concurrently. And I think since I'm American, I've kind of learned American history, but I struggle to understand British history and the whole picture of what was going on. So if you're thinking about this in terms of history for both regions, right? So in 1776, that's the American Revolution. The British really start digging in the 1700s into India. They first arrive in the 1600s. So I think something I didn't understand is the British had these kind of twin economic powerhouses where they were basically stealing resources from their American colonies and their Indian colonies at the same time. And what I found really striking to understand is the similarities, right? Is one of the chief exports from India was cotton, and the same with the American South. And obviously in both cases, we're seeing really exploitative labor practices there. But I didn't ever put together that these were happening at the same time. So that's the first thing that I really took was I need to better understand the whole world picture. And I think another kind of area that I'm really weak on is what was happening for the African continent, right? I've read King Leopold's Ghost, which is about the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's relatively recent. That was like, I think in the mid 1800s that was happening. So compared to the colonization of the Americas and the British colonies in India, very different time span. So I want to go back and understand, the British colonization of Kenya and Nigeria and understand more of just what was going on. So that's one takeaway from this is I have a lot more reading to do effectively. But what I found really striking here is the complicated causes of Indian independence, right? I think the story I was told as a kid was like basically civil disobedience and nonviolent non-cooperation from Gandhi sealed the deal. And that was certainly influential. And it was really smart. And it's really inspiring to look at that as a model for how to gain political power and really help people out. But it's not as simple as that. There were a variety of movements among a variety of groups. We used a wide variety of tactics. And frankly, I don't understand all of what was going on well enough to say, I'm still working on trying to remember everything. There's a bunch of books I have lined up to read about this. That was one of the takeaways too, is I found this is more than just a week-long deep dive. So I'll be reading about this for quite a while to come. But what I found actually most striking in all of this was the relative lack of violence in terms of the independence movement. And I think to some degree, this has been used as like a cover for the British. I think the British have done one of the most effective rebrands in world history, where if you really look at their record and what they did around the world, for a very long period of time, they were pretty horrific in a wide variety of places, right? But I think the British, the UK you see now, obviously is diminished, but also the monarchy is seen as kind of cute and interesting, like tabloid worthy. And I think part of the way this happened is the British were very good, at least in this case, at kind of offloading the independence movement. So I think the way, from what I can see, the way the British played this is they pulled out of India kind of preemptively with the goal, I think, of avoiding a bloody revolution and keeping their hands clean. And then in partition, by splitting India and Pakistan in ways that really didn't make sense geographically, they then set up this huge amount of violence and violence that they had loaded up, right? So I think sometimes from some of the things I read, it was like the partition was this blow up of, existing tensions. And I don't read it that way. I read it as the British were leaving and there was all this tension because of hundreds of years of occupation. And they set it up so that it would blow up on their way out and it would look like maybe they were keeping it together, So the thing that ended up capturing me most was the partition. And I've understood very little of this. I've heard about it kind of from Bollywood movies I've watched, but I've never really grappled with it. And first of all, the way this land was divided was crazy and irresponsible. So basically, modern day Bangladesh and Pakistan were considered Muslim territories, right? So it was like, okay, all Muslims go there. And then India was considered Hindu. And so, first of all, this was a British plan, very, trying to think of the word, very like boxy, right? You're trying to put people in specific boxes. That's not really how things were historically. In general, you would have very diverse communities, very diverse cities. And there was a lot of mixing of not only religion, but language and culture, right? Because over hundreds of years, you have invaders from Persia that came in from the north and the west and took over, but also assimilated. So you have like some Persian culture. That's where you're getting some of Islam. And then you have from the north, like kind of Central Asian culture, you have the Mongols coming down over the steppes and the plains, and you have the Mughal Empire was happening for hundreds of years, and you have more cultural mixing there, right? You have influence from the east, from trade with China, and you just have a big melting pot of cultures. And so to try to deconstruct the melting pot, that's kind of what the British tried to do. And obviously that doesn't work very well to aggressively change something like that. And I think further, there was some degree, and this is what I need to learn more about, there was some degree of sowing of tensions by the British over time is my assumption. Because you don't see this type of tension preceding the British Empire in the region, right? But all that said, partition is basically, first of all, one of the largest human migrations in world history. You have people, moving from their homelands, have been in, for in some cases, hundreds of years, to Pakistan or Bangladesh. And then vice versa, you have folks coming from what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh, Hindus coming from there into the region. And obviously there's fighting that breaks out and millions of people died. It's a horrific history. It's very deeply tragic, and it's in stark contrast to the relative peacefulness of the independence of India. And I think that's intentional, and that's really, I think, part of this play of the British to leave before it got ugly so the blood wouldn't be on their hands. That's one of my takeaways, and I may be reading that wrong, but that is the way I read it. Now, one other note I have here is I really need to learn more about the consequences of the British rule and what it looked like throughout the region. It changed quite a bit over time. One of the things I want to really lay out, though, is I think in some cases the British are seen as benevolent imperialists, and I don't know enough to like fully knock that out, but I think one of the things that really struck me is the level of famine that was allowed to occur in India under the British. 55 to 60 million people died during British rule in India of famine, and very preventable. They were exporting food to Britain and to their other colonies and not giving it to people in India. I think one of the things I continue to learn and struggle to understand as someone born in America in the 2000s who's white is just how horrible colonialism was and is, and I think it's still going on. I think that's something I misinterpret as well and misunderstand is how much this is still active today. But it's continued to be nailed into me the more this type of reading I do, just the depths of the horror of this and how hard it is to go back and understand, in part because, one, I speak English, and that is the language of the folks who did the colonizing, so obviously things are going to be biased. But two, I think I'm American, and it's difficult with our education system. We don't learn a lot about the world. So that's part of why I'm doing this, just trying to plug holes. All right. So let me try to sum up here a little bit. So one, what I found interesting, and then I'm going to dig more into in the future, is the interaction between British colonialism in the Americas and India. I think one thing that was really kind of salient for me was the fact that Christopher Columbus was looking for a route to India when he came upon the Americas. And I think that is really important for me to start to understand and recognize and try to learn that side of history as well. Because I think I've learned a lot about American history, but I struggle to learn about the history of the world and how those interacted. So one was I underestimated the interplay between the Americas and the Indian subcontinent in the British Empire and how that enabled them to do things that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. The other thing that really struck me was the contrast of the relative peace of the Indian independence movement and the partition, and how I think that was kind of by design per the British. Now, in that case, I really want to understand World War II better, because I think World War II is really, really impactful in the kind and scope of colonialism around the world. And that seems like a tipping point that I need to understand better. So this week's deep dive is more about what I don't know and what I'm going to learn in the future. But I do hope you learned something. And if you have anything to add to this or more resources, books I should read, videos I should watch, I would love any recommendations.